So there's still attendees joining, but we'll get started and people can roll in. We want to make sure we finish on time so that everyone gets to who wants to watch a vice presidential debate can do so. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to learn about the Justice Catalyst Fellowship. I will introduce us. We'll introduce ourselves in a second, but I wanted to start with just a couple of logistical notes. This webinar is being recorded and may be posted on our website, but since it's a webinar, the only people being recorded are the panelists, so nothing for you to worry about. That means that the way you can engage with us is through the Q&A function or through the chat. And we ask that at any point during the webinar, you enter questions you have in the Q&A function. The chat works too, but we prefer the Q&A function, and then we'll address those most likely at the end, maybe a couple as they come in, but most likely at the end. So you can enter those anytime. Without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Jasenia, who's going to start introducing us.
Great. Thank you, Jacob. So this is Jacob. Jacob is the Associate Director of Justice Catalyst. He's been here for a couple of years, maybe even half a decade, if I'm so bold.
Not quite, getting there.
My name is Jasenia. I am a Program Associate here at Justice Catalyst. I joined this June, and I'm very excited to work with Jacob on the fellowship and other things that Justice Catalyst is working on. And Keisha will be joining us later. She is a Director of Fellowships at Public Rights Project, and she is liaisoning with us for the Justice Catalyst Public Rights Joint Project, Joint Fellowship, and she will be joining us shortly. So today this is the things that we'll be discussing during this webinar. So first we'll be discussing who we are, what is Justice Catalyst, then we'll transition into the fellowship, and then we'll give you certain details about the timeline and things like that. And we'll talk about other components of the application, including the prospectus and the final application, and some tips from past fellows, what has worked well, what has needed some fixing, and we'll highlight some projects. After that, we'll discuss some of the programming that happens with the fellowship and some of the community that we try to foster here at Justice Catalyst with our fellows, which we love. And then Keisha will come and she will discuss the Justice Catalyst and Public Rights Project Joint Fellowship, and she'll go over some of the specific details that are particular to that fellowship, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So one thing that is important to note, just in case you've seen our website, it's important to distinguish some of the information that you've been coming across. So we here are of Justice Catalyst, but we have a sister organization called Justice Catalyst Law. So the fellowship is with Justice Catalyst. Justice Catalyst Law does not do the fellowship. Justice Catalyst is a nonprofit law firm that takes on social justice issues that fall between the cracks of traditional advocacy models by applying a cross-disciplinary approach to the law with the ultimate goal to protect consumers, workers, and marginalized groups. And I will hand it to Jacob to discuss Justice Catalyst.
So yes, so that was Justice Catalyst Law. Jasenia was just describing, as she says, not part of the fellowship, but a sister organization. It is worth, if you're interested, looking at the website, seeing some of the litigation you can find on there, on news updates and list of ongoing cases that Justice Catalyst Law is involved with. Even though the fellowship is very distinct and it doesn't at all, the vast majority of fellowship projects have no relation to the programmatic work that Justice Catalyst Law is doing. There still are often overlaps, and it's worth checking that out. So Justice Catalyst, the organization that runs the fellowship, also has several different aspects, which I'm going to touch on briefly. So we do a lot of work with partner organizations on special projects. That includes grant recommending and advising, and fostering projects and collaborations between different parts of the legal system, between different types of legal actors. So sometimes that's between litigation specialists and membership organizations and other parts of the legal profession. We host events when that's the kind of thing that's happening as a means of building some of these collaborations. And we generally try to promote innovation in social justice lawyering. That includes bringing new tools to bear, sometimes tools from one part of the legal system to another. This is also Justice Catalyst's law approach. So as an example of that are some of Justice Catalyst's law's antitrust cases in criminal legal system areas. There's a ongoing litigation against bail bondsmen in California that is an example of that. Often this is about going after powerful actors, and especially looking at the entanglement of public and private actors and trying to identify the private actors and corporations who are often profiting from injustice and reinforcing unjust systems. We at Justice Catalyst believe that there's a lot more work that lawyers can do in these kinds of areas, while also holding an awareness that the role and prominence of lawyers should be very different in different types of work. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. One of the barriers, we think, is that new lawyers are not trained to do the kind of systemic work that we think is most vital. They're not encouraged to do that, and vitally, they're not funded to do that. And so we try to fill those gaps in all kinds of ways, including through this fellowship program. So that's why you're all here. So I'm going to now move on to talking a bit more about the fellowship in greater detail. So I'm going to start by talking about the type of projects we're interested in. And that is because our fellowship program is really a project's primary fellowship program. That means that when you're applying, the main thing you're doing is writing about the project that you're interested in applying to do, and that's the main thing we're looking at. Of course, we're interested in your ability to carry out that project, but the main thing we're looking for is at the project itself. So that's the first thing. We have a whole wide range of different types of projects that we support. Most of them start by identifying a problem. So there's a problem you've identified in the world, an injustice, and your project is seeking to address or mitigate in some way that problem. We are especially excited about approaches to addressing problems that are radical, that aim at broad-scale change, that are systemic, and that are sustainable. So let me broaden out a few of those things. One way of summarizing what we see as our role in the fellowship space is we're most excited about funding the work that we think is hardest to get funding for elsewhere. And so we think it's very difficult to get funding to do radical work. And so that's one reason, as well as our own interests, that we want to support radical work. We think it's difficult to get funding doing work that is aiming at broad-scale change. We think it's much easier to do, say, direct representation, get direct representation funding, than it is to aim at broad-scale change. That's not to say that direct representation can't be a big part of our projects. It is a big part of many of our projects, or to say that we undervalue that. We think it's vitally important, but we think that the place where there's really a gap in funding is projects aiming at broad-scale change. I'm just answering a question that's coming in that yes, this video will be posted on our website. Unfortunately, we don't have a captioned, captioner, but we will, when we post it on the website, we will try to get captioning for it. I'm seeing someone's raising their hand. I'm not sure that this allows you to speak this function, so you have to enter questions in the Q&A. So we also are excited about projects that are sustainable. This goes with broad-scale change. We want to support projects where there's a plan for the project to continue in some way beyond the fellowship term. That may mean a fellow being hired at a host organization. It may mean that the host organization plans to continue in some way, or some partners of the host organization plan to continue the work, or it may be that the work is a pilot or something that is somehow self-reinforcing. So that, a type of sustainability we might look at is there an ongoing funding potential for this type of work later, whether that's through grants or through fee shifting. It's not that you have to identify that exactly in your application, but it's the kind of thing that we're interested in. If you say, here's a project, and if we can do this pilot, then the organization will be able to continue it on, then that's certainly encouraging to us. Another type of project that we think is difficult to get funding for are project ideas that are in development or that are prospective. So you may have the grain of an idea, you think there really should be someone doing this kind of work, but you haven't fully worked out all the details yet. That can be a barrier to applying for fellowships, we think, and we want to support those kind of projects. And Jasenia a bit later will be mentioning how our application process is designed to foster those kind of projects. But we want you to be able to tell us your ideas, even if you haven't fully worked out every aspect or you need some help with that. And that's what our prospectus is for. And those are kind of projects we want to support, because we think sometimes people have great ideas and just need a little support in maybe identifying host organizations or identifying the people they want to reach out to as part of developing those ideas, and we want to be part of that process. There are no subject matter restrictions on our fellowship, so we'll support any subject areas. Our focus is primarily US, and the vast majority of our fellowships have a US connection at least. That doesn't mean they're necessarily based in the US. We have a few fellowships based outside of the US, but there's usually some kind of nexus. So for some immigration projects, we have some immigration projects that are based in Mexico, but certainly have a connection to US immigration policy, and we have many of those. We have some projects that are focusing on the role of US-based corporations abroad, not exclusively, but primarily, so that may even be based abroad. We have a fellow based in Amsterdam, at least remotely, this year, and are open to that as well. But our primary, so you're welcome to apply with a project that's not US-based or US-focused, but our primary focus is US. And when you're thinking about a project, one of the big things we want you to be thinking about is, what is the theory of change? What's the theory by which you are trying to apply your approach and your solution to the problem you've identified? So I'm going to talk about theories of change in a second. I saw someone else put their hand up. Just another note: I don't think we can call on you when you put your hand up. So if you could put any questions in the Q&A. Back to subject matter restrictions quickly. We are especially focused, I would say, and looking for more projects on workers' rights, consumer protection, economic justice, corporate power, antitrust approaches. These are areas that connect to some of Justice Catalyst Law's programmatic work, and we would love to see more projects there. We don't get many applications in those fields, so we certainly encourage those. But again, the vast majority of our projects are not connected to those areas. We have a lot of immigration projects. We have a lot of projects focusing on policing and prisons. We have reproductive rights projects. We have projects focusing on climate change. And again, no subject matter restrictions on our projects. So a little bit more about theories of change. So one of the things that we ask for in your application is your theory of change, by which we really mean how your approach addresses the problem that you've identified. And those theories of change can be very varied. There's no one way. What we really want to see is that you've thought about it. You've thought about why the approach you want to take really matches the problem you're trying to address. So the main thing to know is that there isn't any kind of bucket you have to fall into or anything that we're prioritizing. In fact, we don't want all of our fellows to be using the same strategies. We'd like to have a diversity of all types, including of project types. Here are some theories of change you might think about, though. We have some projects that we might think of as affirmative litigation projects. That might be a kind of impact litigation. It might be an affirmative practice in a place that is primarily defensive. We have a few projects like that, which are based in legal aid offices or public defenders offices, and are bringing an affirmative practice to a primarily defensive organization, with the idea of seeding that through their practice and trying to use that to shift some power between their clients and the other side. I'm seeing a question in the chat about repeating project areas. We'd like to see more projects that we don't get many of. Workers' rights, Jasenia has put that in as well. Consumer protection, corporate power, antitrust are some of those areas. Economic justice. So that affirmative litigation is one theory. We have projects that are aiming at targeting powerful actors. So your theory of change may be that there is some powerful actor, which could be the state, but often is private corporations and interests that are part of upholding an unjust system, and that by targeting them is a lever to try to address those injustices. An example of that might be we have projects and also partner organizations looking at the role of private actors within private and also public prisons. So say the providers of telecom services or medical treatment within prisons, people who are profiting off the existing system, and we think that can often be a lever, and a theory of change can be to target those powerful actors, but also, of course, powerful state actors in many of our projects, policing projects, say. There are many projects which have theories of change involved in movement lawyering. So the idea of some is that the role of the lawyer is to try to empower existing activist groups or community organizations, and to do their lawyering as part of that. And that's the theory about how you get broad scale change, not through winning a case necessarily, but through empowering a movement. And we have projects and organizations devoted to that in places around the country. A theory of change might be that you're doing coalition work or gap filling or infrastructure building. We get a lot of great applications which are focused on, there's this existing group that's already working on a topic, but they're having trouble coordinating, and having a fellow dedicated at one of the organizations as part of a coalition, say, could help move that coalition forward. Another type of project that might fit into this theory of change would be projects working on databases. So often there are a lot of groups who are maybe ready to be mobilized, but there needs to be someone to either get hold of or make accessible or available some data or some facts that will be useful to a coalition. So say a databases of police misconduct is an example of this, and someone doing that work can really have a broad effect. And there are various organizations doing that around the country, based on public defenders offices and other places that are trying to kind of build that infrastructure for other groups as well as their own. Another theory of change which can apply to many projects is piloting a new strategy. So it may be that you're trying something somewhere with the hope that if it's successful, and when you have a proof of concept, then other organizations may pick it up, or it may spread to other jurisdictions or other states. So we have many projects that fall into that kind of bucket as well. And you might think of that as a way of aiming at broad scale change. I can't emphasize enough that this is some ways of thinking about theories of change. We really don't want you to look at this list and say, okay, I have to fit into one of these categories. Our hope really is that you will think about the problem you want to address, think about an approach to addressing it, and use that to develop your theory of change. But we do want you to think about that. I'll just mention a couple, and a good example of the coalition work and gap filling is Innovation Law Lab in immigration work, especially that is built has a huge infrastructure for immigration lawyers around the country to work, and I think that's a great example of that kind of work. That they also do their own litigation, of course, and that's part of it, but they have this infrastructure element as well. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about host organizations and thinking about the right host organization for your project. The first thing I'll say is You don't have to have identified your host organization, especially before submitting the prospectus. And we'll talk about those, the prospectus in a second. But the prospectus stage, many people have identified hosts and many have not. By the final application stage, we usually do expect you to have identified a host organization. Though if you haven't, that's also fine. Still apply, and we can that may work as well. But encourage you to find a host by the final application. The main thing we want to emphasize about our host is that hosts are also very varied. We're open to a very, very wide range of different types of host organizations, as I'll discuss. And so it's really about identifying the best place to do the kind of project you want to do, and identifying the host that is the best fit for your project. It may be the best fit because of the expertise the host organization has, because of the resources they have to support you and support the project and support the work, because they're part of a coalition that's already working on this and is ripe to be activated and pushed on the project you're trying to do, and because they share a commitment with you to making this project happen, and to the work you want to be doing. Many of our projects the ideas for projects can really come from either direction. So it's very important that there is this shared commitment from the fellow and from the host. But sometimes there are projects that really hosts come up with and they're looking for fellows to do them. Sometimes there's ideas that prospective fellows have, and they're going to approach host organizations and saying, would they be interested? We think both of those are great, and either one is a great model as long as you end up in a place where the fellow and the host are both committed to the project and to doing what's necessary to get it done. We are very open to having fellows at non-traditional host organizations, and by that, that can mean small organizations that don't normally think of themselves as the type of organizations that can get postgraduate law school fellowships. It could even be an organization that doesn't have any lawyers on staff. We don't require a legal supervisor for your fellowship. You know, some types of projects you'll definitely need it, and so it's not that you should think you can go do anything by yourself necessarily, but some types of projects your supervisor doesn't need to be a lawyer, and that's fine too. We have projects at unions. We have projects in state, local, and tribal governments, especially the PRP Joint Fellowship, which you'll hear about later. We have projects at plaintiffs' firms where there's a very clearly defined public interest, both of the firm and of the project itself. And so plaintiffs' firms can be hosts. And we also have many projects at what I would say is the more traditional organizations, large public interest organizations that take a lot of fellows, the ACLU, for example. So it's not that you have to be looking at a small, non-traditional organization, but we're certainly open to those. I will say it's easiest for us when the host organization is a 501c3, a nonprofit. That just makes it easiest for us to fund them. But we're committed to finding ways to fund fellowships at other organizations as well, and we will work with you to make that happen. And there's many ways to do that. So don't feel you should try and avoid a traditional organization, but we're definitely open to that. One way to think about the projects and hosts that you might be interested in doing. Quickly I'll say, this is another example where of our commitment to diversity also applies to host organizations and to projects. We really like to have a lot of different strategies being tried by fellows, a lot of different host organizations, and so you shouldn't at all think that you have to fall into one of the categories that you can find. Having said that, you can look on our website to find some of the past projects that we have supported, and that surely is some evidence of the type of projects that we're interested in. Though again, we're a relatively new organization, a relatively new fellowship program, and we're hoping to support projects in areas that we haven't done so far. But still, you might browse through justicecatalyst.org/fellows, where you can find all the existing and past fellowship projects. If you look at justicecatalyst.org/news, you can find a recent press release announcing this current class of fellows that may also be helpful and meant as a good way. It's on the right here of the screen. It's a good way of seeing what kind of projects fellows are doing this year. So that's a little bit on past projects, and I'm now going to turn over to Jasenia to talk about the timeline.
Thanks, Jacob. And one other thing I'd say on the past projects, I'd suggest reading it just to be inspired by the projects that the fellows are doing. I mean, they're doing incredible work at a plethora of organizations across the country and even internationally, and I would just suggest to give them a look because they're doing awesome things. But on the fellowship timeline, so as Jacob said earlier, we structured the fellowship timeline to reflect our goals of having projects that are still in development or that are still prospective. So you'll see that we have this two-stage timeline, which includes a prospectus, and we are in full swing for prospectus season. So we are accepting those rolling up until October 13th. So if you have applied, we are still reviewing submissions, and we expect to return feedback within the next 2 weeks. But of course, we will be in touch with you shortly. And this is optional, but this is definitely highly recommended. We give you feedback on what direction that your prospectus is headed. If we think that you should maybe reach out to this individual, or maybe you should consider this angle, we'll give you that kind of feedback, and you can consider that for your full application. And then the full application is rolling up until November 30th. That is required. And the interview, we will reach out to you if we want to interview you, and that is selective, and that will be mostly during the winter. And our final decisions are around February 15th, and of course that is still rolling, so we will be in touch with you around that time. And then after that, there's also the potential for a renewal for your project, and that is a lot more subjective in terms of timing. Some fellows start earlier, some fellows start later, and we are in touch with you specifically in regards to your renewal. So our next slide shows where you can find this on the website. So thank you. So on the website, this is under the fellowships tab that you can see. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth one there. If you just click that, it'll send you to all the information that we have of our fellowship. So it's justicecatalyst.org/get started. And that offers the information sheet, all our frequently asked questions, which we'll discuss at a later time during this webinar, and then has the form submission platforms for the prospectus and the fellowship application, as well as your letter of recommendation. And also I want to note on this tab, it's a drop down, and it also lets you apply to our PRP fellowship. It's the second drop down on that tab. Great. Oh, Jacob, you're still on mute.
Thank you. So I was saying thank you, Jasenia. And as Jasenia said, the prospectus, the goal of the prospectus is really for you to be able to submit, especially those projects that are still in development, but also for you to be able to, so that we might be able to give you some feedback on those, but also so that we can give you some indication about the likelihood of success of your project. And that's really to save you work. So the prospectus is much briefer than the full application, and we want to be able to give you an indication that if this seems like a good fit for us or not. If the prospectus is not required, it's only suggested, highly recommended, we say. And we never say you can't apply. So whatever we say, and we'll email you in response to your prospectus, whatever we say there, you're always welcome to submit a full application on the project you submit for the prospectus or on a different project. But we're giving you some hints so you can decide whether it makes sense. So as the prospectus is optional, also anything within it is optional. Really, we just want you to send us what you think will help us get a grasp on the project idea and be able to give you some feedback on it. But things you might think about including are the problem statement. So what's the problem your fellowship is trying to address? And all this information is in the info sheet on the page that Jasenia just mentioned. Your approach to addressing that problem, your theory of change. You might mention why this model or this approach is unfunded, or conversely, what models or analogs there are to this type of approach that you're drawing inspiration from. You might mention a particular skills or experience or connection you have to this problem or to this approach. You might include elements of your listening tour. So we think a very important part of developing any project is identifying the people who you need to speak to work out what the project is and to work out how to develop it. So that's not just people at a prospective host organization, but who are the other experts out there? And by experts, could be in academics, it could be lawyers, it could be people with experience of the problem, it could be community groups. Who are the people you want to speak to make sure that this project makes sense to do at this time in this place? And so we encourage you to listen widely and to reach out widely, and you can mention the type of people you have already reached out to or hope to reach out to or have already spoken with in the prospectus if you like. We also have a space for a statement of diversity, which you're welcome to leave blank if you want to, but we very much encourage applications from traditionally marginalized groups and from people who may not think of themselves as traditional fellowship applicants, and there's room to discuss diversity if you want to on both the application form and the prospectus form. And again, there's also a space to attach your resume to the form, and the deadline for that is coming up October 13th. And really, the prospectus does not have to be highly developed. Some prospectuses are kind of beginning to be draft applications, and some are much briefer and just saying, here's a project idea, and this is what I'm thinking about. And either one of those is fine, and there's no downside to submitting a prospectus. We're never going to say, oh, this wasn't fully formed enough, and grade you down for that. The whole point of the prospectus is to allow you to send something briefer and less polished before the full application. So really do encourage you to submit a prospectus. The final application I'll spend a bit less time on because it's relatively similar. It's in the same place. It has some summary information. It has room for a project description, which is really a fleshed out form of the same elements in the prospectus, but it's longer this time. With the final application, again, the norm is that you have identified a host organization, and then we need a commitment letter from the host organization, and which you can attach. And there are instructions on the website about what goes into that commitment letter. It's essentially saying that they're committing to do this project. Again, you attach your resume. There's a space on the website for submitting letters of recommendation. It's separate, so the recommender can upload them themselves and just mention, include the name of the person they're recommending. We don't require these, and they're not a big part of our review. But in fact, we originally did not want to have letters of recommendation, but many people seemed very eager to include them, so we gave a space for it, but leave it entirely up to you whether or not to include them. Some people do submit, especially projects that are around movement lawyering, do submit letters of support from community groups or organizations they're hoping to work with separate from the host organization. So that's something else that could be uploaded there, or you could attach with your application, whichever works better for you. There's also, you can mention in the application, you'll note that you've had a prospectus, and the deadline for those applications, the full applications, is November 30th. There's a question which I'll answer now about rolling application. Is it better to apply sooner rather than closer to November 30th? I think all things equal, it probably is. Sometimes we will make some decisions earlier and before the deadline, and in some cases, applicants may want to begin work on a project while they're still during this year, if you're a 3L while you're still in law school. And so we encourage that, and if we review an application earlier, we can make a decision earlier. I will say that the vast majority of applications decisions we end up making on our regular time frame. So it's unlikely to make a difference, but it can't hurt to submit earlier. So that's the full application, and again, all details of what goes into that on the website. We then conduct interviews for selected applicants on a rolling basis. Those primarily happen in January, and I will be on all those interviews, sometimes other people, but it's always me. And the focus in the interview is really on the project. So not asking you many questions necessarily about yourself or kind of what you might think of as standard interview questions. It's really on the substance of the project that we want to talk with you about. Those happen over Zoom, We were Zoom hipsters who were using Zoom for the past few years before everything, the whole world became on Zoom. So we still have this logo here. And then final decisions are released in February. You might hear back from us before that, but that's the latest, February 15th. A few tips for applying. I'm seeing it's about the application. A question I'll just answer now because it's on that about where applications due by close of business or by 11:59. We are actually not fussy about this. So if it, definitely 11:59 is fine. To be honest, if it's 1 a.m., that will be fine too, especially with people in different time zones. We don't want to work that all out exactly, and we pride ourselves on our flexibility. So if you submit broadly on the deadline, we're going to accept your application. And if you have any technical issues, please don't worry about that. We've had in the past people have submitted, thought they submitted and it hadn't come through, and we'll then give you another chance to submit. So we really want to be flexible. So a few tips to think about. And I'm going to divide these up by strategy and theory of change. And these are just things that we've learned from reviewing many of these applications over a few years. If your theory is built around impact litigation, some things to be aware of are a timeline. I mean, most impact litigation takes longer than a fellowship term. That's completely fine. But you want to at least address that and think about that. How's the project going to continue? Does the organization, your host organization, have the resources to engage in impact litigation, which can be time-consuming, requires expertise, and so on? And think about what your theory of change is. The federal courts, you may have noticed, are not favorable to all justice-focused causes at the moment. And so, we want to see that you've thought about why this impact litigation, there's still plenty of room for impact litigation, of course, but you need to be thinking about it and why there's a good chance of success here. If your project is built around direct representation, which many of our projects are, we think that's extremely important work, and we think that many other broader theories work far, far better if they're tied to direct representation components. And those are the direct representation projects that we most often support. So that it's tied to some kind of broader strategy, and that generally means more than just that you'll be splitting your time between direct representation and something else. We're interested in what's the connection between those. How is this direct representation work supporting the other type of work that you're going to be doing as part of your fellowship? If your project is based around research and advocacy, we think that's great, and we have projects built around those as well. If it's research, we'd want to see, is there a strategy for ensuring that this research is used? There's a ton of great research that's done, and then no one reads it. And there's also a ton of great research that's done that has enormous impact and really can catalyze or spark real change and movement towards justice. And so we want to make sure that you're doing the latter and not the former, so that it's not just, I think someone should study this, but I want to study this, and there's a way that there are groups that are interested in it already, or there's already a coalition in place, or some way for us, or the host organization is going to then use it, some way that the research will be used. I think, and just mention an example that I love with a partner organization of ours where there's currently a fellow, is Arch City Defenders, which had a successful Close the Workhouse campaign in St. Louis, and had some reports as part of that campaign, and were incredibly thoughtful in how those reports fit into a broader strategy. So that's the kind of thoughtfulness. You can look at their reports if you like, and that's the kind of thoughtfulness that we'd like to see as well. If it's an advocacy project, we want to see something about some evidence that the conditions are ripe for success here, that there's some reason to believe that this advocacy push will lead to something productive, maybe because there's existing efforts you can tap into, or there's something particularly ripe for some reason. We just want to hear more about why now's the moment. If you are doing coalition work or infrastructure work as part of your strategy, does the coalition exist? Is there a coalition that's ready to be formed just with a fellow to do it? Are there networks in place? Is this a project that can work beyond the fellowship term? So will you build up a coalition for a year and then it's all going to fall apart when you go and do something else? Or is there something that can be sustainable about it? If your project revolves around community education, are you confident that there's an audience there for you? Or can you create these, are there community groups that are already interested in say, the know your rights trainings you want to do? Is there a plan beyond just the trainings themselves that say you're training a community? Is there are they going to be able to use those trainings in some way, implement them, be empowered by them? So anything you can tell us about that beyond just the fact that you'll do some trainings itself is helpful for us. A tip is submit a prospectus. Can never hurt, can only help. Don't need to say more there. And listening tour. Really, the more you reach out, the more you find out who the groups are working in this space, what the needs are, what the opportunities are, the better your application is going to be. And you'll be able to include that in your application and show us that you've really identified what the needs are and why this project is the right one for the moment. So those are some tips. I'm going to turn back to Jasenia to talk a little bit about some of our programming and community building.
Thanks, Jacob. So one thing we want to focus on right before we hand it off to Keisha to discuss the public rights projects, our joint fellowship with them, is our programming and building community section. It's incredibly important to us in social justice lawyering or public interest lawyering to foster this kind of community and the ability to develop coalitions and other like-minded lawyers that are pursuing similar things as you are. So in achieving those ends, we regularly or periodically reach out to our fellows with individual check-ins or group calls with our introductions and orientations. We had a retreat. This year it's going to be, of course, virtual, but we're really excited for that. We also have a reading group that we're starting up, and that's just to share different interests of either books or articles, or just to foster more collective knowledge. And of course, we really like to put a plug in for substantive collaboration. If we have two fellows that are working on similar projects, be they, for example, immigration work, we want to put them in touch with one another. We want to develop this line of communication for other fellows to see each other as resources and to make sure that they are tapping into this kind of network that we're providing, or fostering rather. And also, of course, we want to mention our emphasis on mentorship and connecting you with others that could help you develop your project or push that forward. And I also want to mention that these are all flexible, and we're really open to hearing more suggestions in what could better foster community or what other programming ideas that fellows could ideate. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Keisha, who will be discussing our Justice Catalyst and Public Rights Joint Fellowship.
Hi, good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Hi, Jacob and Jasenia. Thank you for letting me come today to talk about our projects. Feel free to eat. Thank you. Just to echo what has already been said, our application is very similar with just a few exceptions. So first, any project that you propose to us, it should be in state, local, or tribal governments. It's very focused in this area because we're passionate about building a pipeline for new leaders such as yourselves into local and state governments. And so we're focused in this area because we believe a lot of social change can happen from the ground up. And with that said, we focus on affirmative litigation. Just to give you some background, working in state and local governments in particular, there tends to be a focus on a lot of defense cases when you're working as a worker bee new attorney there. In fact, our founder of the organization was in a similar boat. And she started this organization because she wanted to do more affirmative litigation, which is, for example, many states have extra wage theft laws that need to be implemented, and they're just sitting on the books. Individuals don't have the resources to bring those claims in, and there is an opportunity for, let's say, a state to step in and help workers. Our organization, that's just one example, obviously, but our organization is geared to giving these resources to the government to do more of these cases. Because as you all know, not everyone can afford representation, and the people who need it the most are the ones that we should be helping to move the ball forward in social justice. So that's just one example. I'll talk a little bit about our current fellows. There's one fellow in particular working on that issue, but there are many issues: environmental law, consumer protection. So there's a lot of leeway, even though we are focused on state, local, and tribal governments. Keep that in mind. But you should think expansively in terms of what issues you're passionate about, and which problems you want to solve, and what communities that you're passionate about helping. Another thing is you can submit a perspective to us. Ours is due October 13th, I think, along with the deadline for Justice Catalyst generally. It's not required, but we really do encourage you to do that and or contact us directly. So we'll provide contact information, I think, on the last slide. But you should email us at fellows@publicrightsproject.org if you are really interested, because we'd like to work with you to find the right host office before you turn in your application. That's really important for you to do because we already have existing relationships, and we want to make sure that you have as strong of an application as possible. And just to give you more of a brief rundown of what is also entailed in our fellowship, because you're with us and with Justice Catalyst, you'll also be doing programming with us in addition. We have a really extensive network of folks who are experts in their fields, not just in the areas that you're interested in, but in areas that you may be cross-working with, or areas that you might be interested in the future. There's a lot of people in our network that come and give webinars, give talks. You'll have a lot of opportunity to meet people and talk with attorneys that have more experience, and that's especially important this early on in your career to get that exposure. And we have a lot of opportunities for the fellows to connect with people who are doing the similar work, whether it's exactly what you're interested in doing or something else. So there's a lot of room for exploration and growth, which I think is really important at this juncture. Also, we will have peer mentorship opportunities. You'll have a cohort of fellows in the same boat that you're in, and a lot of opportunity to grow and learn with them, which is really important. In addition to also being close with me and the other staff working with the fellows. The way that it's structured, if you're having an issue, of course we have like regular check-ins, but you can just text us. It's that easy. And that's something that's not always available, especially when you're just starting out in your job. We have quite a few fellows that are working with very busy people. So I think it's nice for them to feel like they have a safety net and they can turn to us for some questions and guidance. So you get extra kind of hand-holding, but in the best way, and a lot of attention from us. Also, PRP itself as an organization has a very active legal team. Within the last 2 months, we've actually filed 6 amicus briefs. So there is a lot of growth and opportunity to work with us in our legal cases right now. Because of what's going on with the election, there are a lot of election protection issues, voting rights issues that are popping up. We just filed an amicus brief on the USPS case. And we just filed an administrative brief on misclassification issues in California. And you can check out our website to see the details, but there's a lot happening. We're already getting our new fellows involved in research. So that's also another thing to consider. In addition to your placement, there's a lot of opportunity to work with us in our legal team. I think, another thing to consider is the application deadline is due December 1st. So you do have a little time if you're unable to get the prospectus out by October 13th. But we really encourage you to contact us as soon as possible if you're interested, so we can really get you matched with the right place and make sure that you have a really strong application for us to review. Again, please feel free to email us at fellows@publicrightsproject.org, and we will get back to you shortly with any questions that you have. And we hope that we hear from most of you.
Thanks so much, Keisha. And I'll turn to Jasenia quickly, and then we'll take some more questions about both fellowships.
Sure. So I'll be really brief. I just wanted to make note that we have a frequently asked questions section on our website. So it's under the fellowships tab again, and it's under the drop down titled information sheets. So this has a lot of the frequently asked questions that we usually get. I'm going to move past them now just so we can open up to questions from anyone who's viewing. So if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A.
Thank you. And so as you do that, here are the email addresses that we've mentioned, and some websites where all the applications, you can find all the applications on Justice Catalyst/Get Started. Also encourage you to visit the PRP website. So I'm going to start answering some questions. Some of the ones I've typed answers to, you can click on the Q&A and see, but I may also say them out loud as well. And Jasenia, while I do that, some of the answers in the chat were sent just to panelists instead of all attendees. So maybe you could copy those and paste them to all attendees as well. There's a question about the Public Rights Project is not just about impact litigation. The joint fellowships, I think there's more of a kind of affirmative litigation enforcement angle on those. It's more normal, but that doesn't describe all the projects. You can look at the current fellows; they're not all doing litigation-based projects, so it's not a requirement. The real distinction is that that's for state and local governments and tribal government. I would just say another. If it's confusing that there's these two, don't worry about it too much. If you apply to either one and we think you're a better fit for the other, we'll consider you for that. So we'll just apply in the place that you think makes most sense, and we'll move it to the other column if we need to. In response to another question about that, you can submit a prospectus for both. So if you want to apply to both fellowships, that's fine, and yeah, submit 2 prospectuses. If you submit, you can also submit multiple prospectuses if you want to, just on the Justice Catalyst fellowship. If you have multiple project ideas, I think the best is to include them in one prospectus, but you can also include them in several. And just if you do indicate that I've already submitted this other one, just kind of let us know so we can track and make sure we're not kind of picking you as 2 different people. We had a question to put email addresses into the chat. So Jasenia, could you do that? Make sure it goes to all panelists as well. Okay, keeping going down these questions. If you receive a response indicating that the project might not be a good fit, will you still receive substantive feedback? You may, but you may not. We get a lot of applications that we can't kind of give substantive responses to all, you know, it may be that it's a subject area that we're getting a lot of applications in, and we just think that some others are more promising or something like that. So we'll try sometimes to give you some indication that might give you a chance to change or modify accordingly, but we can't promise that in all cases, unfortunately. It will not at all be held against you if your project is different from the prospectus. You can choose to apply on a completely different project, and that's fine. So the prospectus is no kind of commitment, and yeah, not held against you at all. I asked a question about the likelihood of renewal for a second year. So I'm hesitant to kind of give too firm an answer here because we're relatively new and we're not sure how it's going to be going forward. But so far, the majority of people who've applied for a renewal, which happens halfway through the first year, have got some kind of renewal. That might be a full renewal, in most cases it is, or it might be a partial renewal, say for 6 months or for a year, but the host is matching, so the grant is just for half. So most people who've applied have gotten some kind of renewal, but I can't guarantee that will happen in the future. The host organization does not need to be a legal organization or nonprofit. Most are, but it does not have to be, and it doesn't necessarily have to be work under a supervising attorney. For some types of projects, we think that's very important. For others, we don't, and so that'll govern whether there needs to be one, but it's not a requirement. I've emphasized novelty. There's a question about how does it have to be distinct. We have had fellows, not every project has to be, creating the world anew. You can certainly be looking at, if there's a past project that's very similar, you can certainly apply in that. You don't have to be the first person ever doing this. And we do have people in consecutive years working on very similar projects, and that's great. You can submit multiple prospectuses. We encourage you to just submit one final application, and we think probably your host organizations are going to would also encourage the same as well. If you really want to have some special reason you want to submit two, you can email us and ask about that. But encourage you to submit as many prospectuses as you want, but one full application. A question about novel theories of litigation and legal theories and what we're looking for in terms of making something unique. I'll say again, it doesn't have to be unique. It could be that you're applying something that's being done somewhere new, or expanding an approach that's already being tried. If you have a novel theory of litigation or legal theory, we think that's great. We think that it's especially important to be working closely with a host organization. There are lots of great ideas that are not practicable for whatever reason, and if you haven't got the experience necessarily to identify that, it's important to do a listening tour, including to find a host organization that's committed to the project. And we also, it's important that the host organization will be able to provide you the resources. It's very rare for one person to be able, especially a junior attorney, to be able to bring novel litigation by themselves. So getting the buy-in for the host organization is important there. If you want the fellowship to start earlier, you can still, we have some fellows who've started off cycle, in March and as early as March, and that's fine. The norm is to start in the fall, but we're open to that. At least we can't guarantee, but we're open to discussing that. And if so, it doesn't hurt to apply early, but if you apply on schedule, we can do a fast turnaround. Keisha or Justine, anything you want to jump in on?
Just in addition to what you talked about for novel theories of litigation, it did make me think of something that we're looking for is just diversity in geographical locations. So if you take a look at our website and see what fellows have done and where they usually are, and you notice, oh, they haven't been in my state yet, that's something that we would be particularly interested in, and something to think about when you're thinking about what host organizations you'd be interested in.
That applies to the Justice Catalyst Fellowship as well. That one of the things we look for is geographic diversity.
Another thing I'd like to mention is that we usually get a lot of questions on if you're a non-501c3 organization, are you still eligible? The answer is yes. And there's nothing that you need to do at this stage. Just write us a line in your prospectus saying, my host organization is a non-501c3, and then we'll be in contact with you later if with the different requirements.
That I'm not seeing any more questions. So if you do have a question we haven't answered, they're in the chat and the Q&A, and I may have missed one. So feel free to email us at any of the emails that we shared and that are on the screen. And otherwise, thank you so much for joining. We hope to see applications from you, whether you're a prospective applicant or a host organization, and would be thrilled to answer any questions you have. And if there's one takeaway, it's submit a prospectus for either fellowship, and that's the best way to find out if the idea you have is a good fit for us. So thanks so much, Keisha. Thanks so much, Yesenia. Thank you everyone for coming, and hope to see your applications.